Hello, everyone. If you're listening to this is the recap of our D&D Icewind Dale campaign. Uh, Special thanks to Vincent for letting me use his audio equipment. That was nice of him. Give him a clap from home. Okay. I hope you heard that. Vincent is in the room and he just said, "You're getting shipped off, bitch." Free to say it again if you like.
No, I'm alright.
That considered, we begin with Part 0, the prelude. In the beginning, far before the age of man, the Forgotten Realms were nothing more than two poles, untouched by life. To the south came a blistering heat, spurned on by raging flame. It burned eternally and scorned any thought of habitation. In the north there was a terrible cold, such that any modern human might touch and simply freeze still. Blanketed with snow, the north's cold raged many years unperturbed. And so came the world's beginning. The heat of the south melted the snow as the ice pierced the fire. So came the Forgotten Realms, a medium for which fire could burn and snow could fall. From neither pole came humanity, a fire greater than any flame, a curse greater than any snowfall. The realm changed when humanity arrived. With humanity came civilization. Upon civilization came greed. Such came the abyss, a realm born of humanity's cruelty, a realm that existed both in reality and out of reality. A dark creature was born that same day in the murky depths. He opened his eyes and stared to the darkness above, a small smile creeping across his face. So forth came Momentous, master of worlds. When humanity found the fire, they learned to cook meat, to heat themselves, and to make war. When humanity found the ice, they learned to use it to heal, to preserve meat, and to protect oneself from the harsh winds. The flame and the ice imbued humanity with their powers. Separately, the flame and ice nurtured the two tribes that worshipped their simple benevolence. 500 years would pass as humanity prospered. After that time, two sons would be born. Oka, a heir to the flame immortal, and Chiru, to the everlasting ice. Oka, on the day of his birth, burned with a flame so hot his mother's womb would be permanently charred. She would bear no more children. Chiru froze his mother's organs during childbirth. She would never recover, leaving him motherless. From birth, Chiru felt a connection to the sacred ice. It was as if the snowy mountains of his homeland were in tune with his very being. Motherless, he would press on, learning the secrets of the north. Oka, meanwhile, made war. He tore his family to shreds in a single night. He would become feared as the Morning Lord, for as the morning sun rose, no one else would be worthy to sit on the throne of flame. As he sat in the morning light, the flame asked but one question. "What is it that you desire?" And the answer came simply. Power. The flame read the will of Oka, kin of flame, how he had sacrificed his family so he might rule, how his strength was unmatched. The fire cast aside those it once protected. In return, it gained the power to destroy. But in doing so, it would bring terrible calamity to the Forgotten Realms. Oka would march north, The Morning Lord, the true ruler of flame, had heard tell of the North, of an element so contrary to its own, it could be considered an insult. In his wake, the sun burned with a terrible curse, vaporizing all witnessed its blood-red glow. The entire continent would know of his march. So much that the spirit of ice would plead with Chiru, the greatest of his kind. Thou must leave the north, and end the heir of flame. Such is thy destiny. Chiru would have no choice but to accept. The doubts in his heart clouded his mind, bringing forth a darkness through which no light could escape. The ice would cool his nerves and steel him for the end of his journey. The south came a burning flame. The south came the Morning Lord, tearing the land asunder. From the north came a fierce chill. From the north came the frost's servant, Chiru. Oka carried a long sword of pure and flaming rage. Chiru carried a slender katana of the purest ice. Their eyes would meet in the same place the flame and snow had met 500 years prior. Flames and snow would lock blades, each knowing that defeat meant death. Oka meant to conquer, Chiru to protect. The dawn of the 365th day, both gods would fall. A year passed as both fought, never gaining ground. In the end, the fire burned the frost, and the chill pierced the flame. Both would fall dead, leaving the world changed. The fire, forever corrupted by greed, would give another heir life after 1,000 years. The sacred ice, knowing it would never be safe, did the same. So the cycle would continue for millennia. Momentous, having been busy with his own abyssal affairs, eventually sired a son, a dark creature like himself in almost every way, except for his dwarven heritage. Some say perhaps he went on a bender, but the story of his son's conception is a story he kept to himself. Or so they say. His son was a Durgar, an unholy mix between abyss and dwarf, with very little psychokinetic power. Momentous had no interest in his ungifted son, and as such neglected him endlessly. By the time he was 10 years old, the son despised his father with a hate so fierce it could scarcely be contained. He would betray Momentous during a conflict, stabbing him in the back with a blade. Momentous survived the first stab, to turn to his son smiling. He could have crushed his skull in a single thought, but paused. After relishing as the helm of chaos for an eternity, Momentous allowed his son to take his life. Perhaps even death might be more interesting than an eternity without change. The son would forge an axe from his bones, using it to break through the ground and world of the abyss, leading a community of Durgar through the tunnel into Icewind Dale, where he would establish a community, the Sunblight Crag, naming himself Dardarak Sunblight, for it was he who had brought about his people's deliverance to the sun. Momentous, amused at his own demise, would find himself bodiless, and with one of the most fundamental human desires, revenge. He looked into the realms between, looking for a suitable host to inhabit, to humor this petty desire. He would find a boy, a small turtle, whose family had recently been completely annihilated. It was perfect. The boy had nothing and no one. He would not be remembered by the cruel earth. A hole in reality opened, and down fell the boy into the abyss. Momentous loomed over the child, on the verge of possessing his body and enacting his will. Perhaps it was the child's unflinching stare that halted the beast. Perhaps it was the faint psychic shock Momentous felt bursting from the boy's mind. Whatever it was, the ancient evil stopped in his tracks. He knelt, picking up the child in his arms. He decided that revenge could wait. In the current moment he found himself with a child to raise. So it was that the ancient evil nurtured the young turtle, slowly feeding him what remained of his power as he slowly died. He taught the boy a great many things, as he was young and brilliant. He vowed to himself that he would make the boy his heir, he who would inherit the role of chaos. And now we come to the events of 10 years ago. With the changing of the times, the flame grew weaker. There were other gods now, and its powers were no longer universal. The flame could not burn as bright as it used to. As such, it resolved to take the ice down with it. The flame was always spiteful, after all. Thus the flame took its most pious follower, Alistair Grimwood, as its heir. He marched to the north, waging war on Furusuto, the current frost servant. Furusuto would suffer an injury, retreating underground, back to his home, Icewind Dale. As he healed, the Morning Lord would colonize Icewind Dale. With his power, he brought heat and light to the chagrin of the people. Furusuto, injured as he was, could not hope to best his ancient rival. As such, he began a campaign to recruit adventurers. He would send letters to strong warriors, most with names lost to time. Of those selected, a Ronin of a Sword Coast village by the name of Asada would be recruited. He, along with the others, followed the letter's instructions, eventually arriving at Icewind Dale, a northern nation dominated almost entirely by large industrial towns and furnaces. Furusuto would sneak the group into his underground lair, informing them of the task they had all been summoned for. This was, after all, not a vacation, despite how lovely Icewind Dale looked. He asked them to disable some furnaces, such that he could lure out the Morning Lord and take his revenge. His assistant, a small human girl by the name of Aurelia, would assist them. She showed her dedication to the Lord of Frost by decimating a naysayer among the party. And so, with the naysayer smushed by a pillar of ice, the adventurers would head to Bryn Shander, an economic powerhouse and massive city, dwarfed only by its own giant furnace. After fighting with the Morning Lord's paladins, they would succeed in powering the furnace down, allowing Furusuto to enter and freeze the remaining paladins. The party would follow the Frost God to the Morning Lord's castle, which sat atop the hill. Frost God would issue a challenge to the Lord of Light. Seeing his foe had recovered, brought allies, and destroyed one of his furnaces, the Lord of Flame decided to use this to its own advantage. "Come now, canst thou not see? Thy true enemy stands there, the conniving Lord of Ice." Conflicted, the party would split in two. Asada followed the way of frost, as the others turned their back on the ice god. The fight began, as the Morning Lord used the ancient flame to boost his power at the expense of his allies. Both gods would grow to giant size and fight, while their companions began to fight amongst themselves. Furosuto would fight as hard as he possibly could, acting in conjunction with Aurelia's firm control of ice magic, to drive back the Morning Lord. And against all odds, they would knock the Morning Lord to his knees, along with several party members. But not before Aurelia was hurled far away. Never one to give up, the Morning Lord would chant a curse. Let all who feel the gaze of my son. Yes, the very same curse of the first kin of flame. Know true despair and crumple to ash. As he chanted, the son of Icewind Dale would bleed at blood red. For I am the Morning Lord, heir apparent to the rising sun. Furosuto, stunned, was the first to crumple. And as if on reflex, Aurelia felt the stinging darkness of her ancestor. But not before the traitors were vaporized, and her master was dead. Sada would survive, but due to the immense trauma and fatigue, fall comatose. Aurelia would gently carry him to what had remained of their underground lair. In time, she would create another, on an isolated island off the northern coast of Icewind Dale. Here she would lay his silent body, freezing it into the ice. When it was done, Aurelia stood atop a frigid cliff to gaze upon the frozen realm. Her frozen realm. Surrounded by night and ice to stave off the horrid curse. As the next 10 years passed, the rest of the Morning Lord's industry would fall. There was simply nothing and no one to protect them from the rampaging cold that stalked them in the night. Driven by vengeance, every single follower would be extinguished, save for one last one, a priestess by the name of Mishon. After all, while she was consumed by revenge, she knew very well the Morning Lord was not dead. She left Mishon alive to give the Morning Lord eyes into her new world, to taunt him with his own helplessness. She left her alive as a ploy, so that the arrogant Lord of Flame would grow attached to the last of his followers within the cold, in the same way that a beast would grow attached to its last remaining child. So it was that she would wait as the years pass. Now we begin Act 1, which is entitled, How Shall We Begin Our Tale? 10 years had passed since the Frost Lord's death. The people had come to fear the name Auril, and begun to sacrifice heat, citizens, and drink to her, in hopes of staving off her frosted will. In reality, she had no such qualms towards any citizen, but with the string of murders over the past 10 years, no one could really tell for sure what she wanted. 10 years, the population of Icewind Dale gathered into 10 towns: Bremen, East Haven, Bryn Shander, Caer Dineval, Caer Konig, Goodmead, Dogan's Hole, Lonely Wood, Targos, and Tourmaline. Our story would begin in the unassuming town of Bremen. It began, as great stories often do, with a tavern, with a group of odd adventurers. Barry, a Goliath of Wormdoom Crag, played by our good friend Aidan. Vorig Boneguard, the arrogant dwarven dragon slayer, played by Henry. Sorrow, a rogue slave trader with a shifty face, played by Vincent. Smoke, a tiefling resident of Icewind Dale, played by Donnie, Charlie, an Aasimar cleric, played by Austin, and finally Quentin, the one who would doom them all, played by Jack. Quentin was a barbarian who had escaped the Grimwood family by butchering them. He left the youngest daughter to sit in a pool of her family's blood. Each of them had their own goals when stepping into the tavern. But by the same twist of fate, they all ended up at that same table. They would talk amongst themselves, chatting until they noticed an elderly shield dwarf staring at them. Wordlessly, she would approach them. She would tell the strangers they looked capable and ask them to listen to her request. "A murderer is loose in Icewind Dale. 3 people have died, and have been found impaled on icy blades." She told them she suspected Sefik Caltro, a mercenary, of committing the murders. After all, he too carried blades of ice, yet wore no clothes to disaway the cold. She confided that he most likely followed the Frost Maiden, the god of winter's wrath. "Ascertain the guilt and deal with him. Don't alert the authorities." A reward of 100 gold pieces each was proposed. After that, the party had a quest. Through by gold or by luck, they were going to kill someone. Although an unlikely bunch, they would band together in search of profit. The 6 of them headed to East Haven, where Caltro was said to be. It was convenient, too, because East Haven and Bremen were surrounded by a large storm, barring anyone from leaving. As a matter of fact, Caltro was out drinking in the tavern of that very town. His girlfriend, Nymetra, was the bartender there, so he drank free sometimes. Some of the party entered the bar, whilst the stealthier ones remained outside as insurance. Those who did venture inside found Sefik to be a slightly off-the-cuff yet charming man, who indeed wore no cold-weather clothing. As they asked about the murders, Sefik smiled a cruel smile. The 3 he had killed were Morning Lord worshippers, but that was unimportant. Truth was, he had murdered them, and he bluntly admitted to it. He chuckled at the party's shock as they hurriedly debated about how to trap and kill him. Eventually, after endless bickering, Caltro finished his drink, sliding a copper coin onto the table and turning to leave. He would turn silently back, facing the dumbfounded party. "Well, come on then." Sefik would walk ahead of the party until everyone reached the large field outside of East Haven. Here he would face the 6 and draw 2 icy longswords from his belt. A fight would begin here in the dead of night, though, to be fair, it was always night in Icewind Dale. The party's actions would be lit only by the glow of the northern lights. The freezing cold would rejuvenate Sefik, as the party quickly realized he was no pushover. But Sefik could not beat 6 opponents. He was grabbed and tied up, before being beaten unconscious and covered with a blanket. The party then debated on what to do with the man. Kill him? Spare him? Turn him in? Sefik would awake during this argument, deciding to broker a deal. "My boss has a chest containing 1,000 gold pieces. If you spare me, I'll take you there." The party was conflicted. This would break their promise to him, but it would give them quite a bit of cash. But after becoming paranoid that Sefik would either escape and alert the guards, or simply stab them in the back, they decided to murder him right there. On that field, they beat him to death. body would turn to falling snow and disappear, leaving only his head. Hiln would congratulate them on a job well done, granting him their reward in exchange for the head. The party was now a real party, bonded through murder, so their strength would increase. They began calling themselves 6 Point and accepting new quests. First of which was a request from a disgruntled dockworker dwarf to catch fish. In addition, an elven researcher asked them to collect data on a mysterious beast that had recently sunk several ships. The party would take 2 boats, one of good quality and one with extensive damage. So much damage that it had a bite mark taken out of it, which wasn't great. Once on the lake, they began to fish, intently looking for the monster all the while. However, this was not to be. The monster found them. A plesiosaur's long, leviathan head would wind its way out of the water. Barry would decide that the best course of action was to immediately toss a stick at the creature. The audible groans of every party member were less embarrassing than the creature's gaze, piercing and challenging. Borig would try striking a conversation, introducing himself and learning the following. First, the plesiosaur had been given sentience by a druid under the Frost Maiden. Second, it was given this sentience only on the condition that it bring terror to the people of Bremen and their ships. But, as the party pleaded, they were not residents of Bremen. They were travelers. Now, Smoke was lying, but the plesiosaur didn't know that. And this negotiation would end on friendly terms. So friendly, in fact, that the creature had a name by the end. Ripple. Ripple gifted the party the fish they needed and proceeded to tell the party of a Frost Maiden follower who had been executed by the citizens. Ripple told them his head was still alive and well beneath the water. This would put the party into a panic. After all, Olivessa possessed one such head, and by their own doing, no less. But their haste did not save the elderly shield dwarf. By the time they returned, she was dead and gone. She was only the first to die due to this party's actions. They believed Sefik had killed her as revenge for her request to the party. In reality, Sefik had only one mission. Icewind Dale needed to fear the Frost Maiden. Defeated, the party would head to an inn to sleep. During the night, Smoke would be visited by a fellow member of the Rags, one Stone. Stone would ask about the status of an asset, and gripe about how their benefactors were pressing him a lot. With their nighttime meeting over, Stone left. When they awoke, they spoke to Cora, the human innkeeper. She would give them 2 reliable pieces of information. Firstly, her son Hugo had been kidnapped by robed cultists with necklaces containing some kind of black ice. And second, the town speaker might be a good person to visit if they wanted to avenge Hlyn. So thus they went to the town speaker, a man named Shalescar. But instead of helping, he would turn to Sorrow, eyes blazing blue. "What are you doing here? Don't you remember?" Sorrow, as a matter of fact, did not remember. But these words were different. Sorrow was always the man in the game for himself. He wasn't the type to care about other people or their grievances. After all, he was a being beyond any mortal plane. He was a spirit that possessed others and could not die. So when a frosted god bore down on his latest form, why did he shrink into a corner? He had possessed a follower of the Morning Lord, someone who should have been powerful. After all, he was powerful. After all, even so, he had been able to destroy an entire family the day he was born. But the frosted image of death before him was a terror beyond him. She plucked his soul from the follower's corpse, looking at his abyssal spirit with disgust. But she was not finished with him yet. Spirit, heed me. Thou shalt serve me, whether thy flesh should wither or not. The cold eyes pierced his own. I have seen your future. To guide thy path is thy redemption. So he would be cast far, far away, into the body of a traveling merchant, with no memory save for one phrase. I must go to Icewind Dale. Even still, the old man's words roused a deep and primal fear in him, so much that he could not speak. The speaker, finished with sorrow, turned to the rest. The storm surrounds Bremen and East Haven, and it still rages on. If the killer is anywhere, it's East Haven. They swore to find her killer. As such, they ventured again to East Haven. But instead of finding a murderer, they found an execution. The treacherous wizard Dazan would be burned to death before their very eyes. East Haven's militia captain would notice their presence and ask their help in finding the fisherman who had recently gone missing. Bereft of clues, the party would agree. After all, more disappearances could mean Suffolk had done it. The two could be connected. Upon East Haven's shore, Six Point would find a cave nearby to a discarded boat. Before they could enter, they were beset by 3 harpies. 2 died by their hands, while one, heavily injured, would escape. The party entered the cave. Inside, they would fight a water spirit, utilizing a waterfall to narrowly scrape out a victory. On some walls lay drawings of the frost giants, who at one time came here to die. As well as this, on some pillars nearby was a glowing blue mineral. Though they did not know it at the time, this was a trap laid for them. The mineral was refined chardoline, blue from the influence the Frost Maiden had over it. She had left this mineral to possess the party, who she assumed would mine it to sell. After all, she had seen them be quite materialistic, through Sorrow's own eyes, no less. This mineral, when held, would allow her direct control of the afflicted. After all, creating more evil minions was part of the plan. Though she did not anticipate Charlie licking the thing. It being a creation of ice froze his tongue immediately. The party tried in vain to unfreeze it and remove him from the wall, though the only thing they could do in the end was remove the tongue. And so it would be that he was tongueless, as it was cut from his mouth. The party would continue exploring, and happen upon an old woman cooking a soup alone, surrounded by the corpses of fishermen. "Ah, well met. Have you come for some soup?" The party, sans Charlie, had no problem taking some. Those who drank the soup would be blessed with an increase to their power, though unorthodox as it was. Alas, since it contained literal human organs, Charlie was disgusted and immediately left. The only thing he would find was a monstrous wolf. Of course, this wolf was not happy to be found, and proceeded to, quote, wreck his shit. Seeing this, the Frost Maiden would sigh. Her plan required pawns, and here the perfect candidate had gone and gotten himself mauled to death. So reluctantly, she would freeze the wolf and regrow his tongue using the snow. The party would find Charlie on the verge of death, with a frozen wolf nearby. They'd be suspicious, but had already decided to leave Maud alone in exchange for gold. She informed them of a chest of it, taking her leave after that. She would then travel to the town of Targos and begin creating another spot to live, where she would remain undisturbed for many years. The party returned to East Haven, telling the captain that they couldn't find anything but the fishermen's corpses. She rewarded Smoke with a bag of tricks, which could summon animals. At this, Charlie felt a sensation, a thought, that his party was wrong. They had the soup, the human soup. Charlie felt an itch to expose their lies, and so he gave in. Their bags have soup made from your fishermen. Sorrow panicked as the guards moved in on him. He fumbled with his bag, trying desperately to hide the soup. Instead, it fell, the container smashing open on the floor, revealing a human heart. "Arrest them!" came the shout. Thinking quickly, Vorig would activate his jump spell, leaping onto the roofs. Sorrow and the others would make their way out as well, while Smoke stalled with the creature from the bag of tricks. Luckily, they would all make it out before the massacre could get fully underway. From everywhere, Frostmaiden followers would enter the town and slaughter the guards. Civilians would be subdued and taken elsewhere. An atrocity had occurred, and at its head stood Sephic, the ringleader, reformed. Nymetra, the dragon-born witch. Charlie, his mind overtaken by the will of the Frostmaiden. And the harpy from before, bolstered by ice. She had been spared to serve a new master. These four gathered as our party fell back to Bremen, under the impression that the entire village of East Haven was being slaughtered. Smoke slipped away to find Stone, only to be followed by Sorrow. Stone would express panic at the thought of the Frostmaiden's attack, stating that they would likely perish. Smoke would choose not to reveal that he knew of a mountain path that would take them outside the storm wall. The party would also not inform Ripple of the urgent danger later. So, when the danger arrived, Stone and the Rags left to fight. They would lose, and in dire straits, hide in the basement of an old bakery. Charlie, newly enhanced with life, would remember the plesiosaur, taking its head as his trophy. After all, it had not done its one basic task. It did not disturb Bremen's residents, as it had let the party escape unscathed. His heart was clouded by bravado. The right path was beyond his sight. Down to 5, the party fled to the great mountain. Such would end the first act of their journey, an innocence leading to tragedy. It is here we begin Act 2, which is entitled, Why Question Our Fated Path? Having abandoned 2 towns to admittedly certain doom, the party would indeed cross the mountain from Bremen into Bryn Shander. On the way, they would run into a shapeshifter, a man by the name of Carragher. "Please, I'm stuck. Do you have any soup?" The party would look upon him with distrust and disdain, as his form resembled the Aasimar that had just betrayed them. Not deterred, he would smell the soup they carried with them. "That's odd. I can smell the soup my sister makes. the soup. He wouldn't get any, though. Instead, they would throw him some rations, and he joined them on their journey to Bryn Shander. Once they had crested the hill, it became apparent the sheer magnitude of the city. Once a hallowed capital in the era of a warmer Icewind Dale, it still retained most of its size and glamour. They would be met at the gates by the city's sheriff, one Markham Southwell. They wouldn't tell him of what they had seen, opting instead to explore the city. It is at this point the party would split up to attain the lay of the land. Quentin would venture to a holy shrine, followed by Carragher, while Smoke, Barry, Vorig, and Sorrow went to the marketplace. In that marketplace they would find an alchemist selling everything from strong poison to love potions. This being our beloved 6 point, of course, immediately they would try to steal some. In a feat that could never be replicated, Smoke cast Mage Hand, grabbing a poison off the shelf. But somehow he tapped the alchemist on the head with it by mistake. And as if by some feat of dumb luck, the alchemist was amazed. "I've finally done it! I've caused the poison to mature into a flight potion!" Elated, he ran to the back to drink it. It, having not been a flight potion, rather, still being a poison, proceeded to do what a poison does best, and kill him. Understandably, the group took their leave, but not before stealing anything not nailed down. While out on the street, they would encounter a few frostbitten dwarves. These dwarves would request that they find a shed filled with iron ingots. They would agree and set off to find Quentin. It is now that I shall take a pause from their story and tell you another. Once there was a young follower of the sun. She followed her fellow faithful to a land filled with ice and snow, something that could be called a heresy to the faith that she practiced. After all, where could the sun be needed more than in a place chilled to the bone? But after the burning, the sun did not shine so brightly. The priestess would shelter it, using her body to nurture it. In this way she would help the Morning Lord recover from his near death, though she knew it not. It was only natural, then, that the priestess Michonne would be favored by the light of the Morning Lord. Quentin would find a shrine in Bryn Shander, a shrine of an ancient faith, molded by time, humanity, and decay. Michonne would greet him warmly as she tended to the place. Quentin would immediately become smitten, and whether convinced by her beauty or by her words, he would pledge his loyalty to the Morning Lord and resolve himself to bring the sun back to Icewind Dale. Michonne would give him the induction rites, a process involving the burning of one's eyes using a focusing lens. Through this he was blind, but he could still see in a sense. He would also feel the same warmth that Michonne had, taking away the chill. He bade her farewell and rejoined the group. They would find the iron ingots guarded by goblins, and defeat them after almost dying in the process. They would return the iron to a blacksmith famous for creating weapons that broke immediately after being touched. Disgusted, they'd leave, but only after hearing about how he'd created a flying suit to be unveiled in 3 days. Quentin, ever the romantic, would try introducing the party to Michonne, but instead they would only find her grumpy roommate, Copper the Rock Gnome. He would inform them he was worried about his friend Macretus, an inventor whom he hadn't heard from in a while. He showed them where to look, and off they went. The location in question was a rickety old cabin on the side of a cliff. Avoiding death, mostly, they investigated, realizing Macretus had indeed died, but had been working on a magical prototype to remove the Frost Maiden's Knight. Vorig touched it with his bare hands, and was immediately incinerated, dying and being dropped into the eternal plane, where he met the vengeful spirit of Macretus. With his help, they fixed and activated the device, allowing a small circle of light to pierce the darkness. The Morning Lord would descend, taking care not to kill any of them with his curse. Even with this little light, his power tripled. He gave his blessing, revived Vorig, and left the party to fight some ice minions. Quentin had piqued his interest, but he would remain from direct contact for now. They'd returned to find Bryn Shander in utter panic. When asked, the sheriff had but one thing to say. "There's an army approaching from East Haven." The storm wall had come down. Bryn Shander was next. The party would prepare to flee, stopped only by Quentin. "I'm taking them with me. I'll be back." He ran to the shrine, quick as could be, informing Copper and Michon of the situation. He begged them to follow him, knowing only their certain doom if they stayed. Copper had another idea. "Why don't you take Lady Michon, protect her a while, and I'll fix up that old cabin. Might be good to have a place to rest. I could send word when it's done, by crow, maybe." So it was that Michon and the party headed to the nearby city of Caer Dineval, and Copper headed to the Black Cabin. Bryn Shander was doomed. Indeed, in the coming days, a surge of the Frostmaiden's forces, led by Sefik, Nymetra, and the Harpy, would decimate Bryn Shander. With the size of the city, some struggles would be left over. So Sefik would eventually depart, leaving the Harpy to finish them. In the meantime, Sixpoint arrived at Caer Dineval, a rather desolate small town. The town had few residents, so when Vorig stumbled in on a group of traveling Durgar, he was quite shocked. They were dwarves of the Abyss, acting under the orders of King Zardarok Sunblight, collecting Chardalyn to build a mighty dragon, one which might burn the Frost Maiden and her evil. Vorig, entranced by the idea, decided to offer his services to them. Their target was set on the Black Knights, a group of cultists residing in the town. The party snuck in and murdered them for their Chardalyn amulets, leaving Michon in a tavern to wait, until they came upon a tiefling woman reading a book to a human teenager. The tiefling was Fel, a cult member who originally was quite fearsome and cruel, but eventually changed her demeanor when she was exposed to Hugo, the child whom the cult had kidnapped from Bremen all those years ago. Upon seeing one of their targets, the boy, the party would make their greatest mistake yet. Barry would briskly cross the room and grapple the tiefling, while Smoke attempted to talk. Fel, alarmed, as I reckon most people would be, getting grappled by a random man, especially of Goliath's size, immediately fought back. Hugo assisted her, but 6-on-2 made for terrible odds. Sixpoint knocked Hugo out before slaughtering his surrogate mother. Satisfied, they took Hugo and their Chardalyn and left to return to the Durgar. Having accomplished their mission, the Durgar would return home. But they were accompanied by Vorig, who had decided to meet this supposed king. The Chardalyn's evil influence would affect Quentin, Smoke, and Vorig. For Smoke, it enhanced his paranoia, causing him to lie and become more defensive. For Vorig, it enhanced his natural bad tendencies, turning his thoughts to self-interest and his love for alcohol into a dependence from which he could not escape. and for Quentin, it enabled his possessiveness, both to his newfound religion and to Michonne. But he had made a critical mistake. Michonne was gone from the tavern. The residents were dead, and the place was covered in ice. A crystal told the story in Charlie's voice. "Hello again! I found a friend in this lovely little tavern. If you want to see her alive again, return to Bremen within the next 3 days." Such began the next step of the Frost Maiden's plan. Having noticed Quentin's strong connections to the Morning Lord, she mused. Perhaps she could manipulate the circumstances so Quentin could inherit the title of Morning Lord. After all, for that to happen, he would have to appear and be vulnerable. Saving a damsel so important would surely increase that chance, especially considering the prior context of Michonne's survival by pure chance and, of course, nothing else. Definitely not Frostmaiden influence. Anyway, 6 Point would try to leave, only to be stopped by a large, tongueless lion man. He stood in the middle of the road, pointing ominously into the woods. The party would follow his input, heading into the woods and coming across a halfling druid by the name of Never Deepwood. He'd be intensely suspicious of the party, and even more when Smoke tried stealing with him. Barry and Hugo would remain outside, with the former lighting a cigarette and striking up a chat. "Excuse me, but could you tell me where my mentor is? She's a tiefling about yay high." Hugo would explain she had protected him from the Black Knights, and they'd been planning to run away when the opportunity arose. At this, Barry felt a stirring conflict, but inside he was a weak man. So rather than face his dilemma, he'd run off into the woods, seeking solitude. Never would eventually decide to help the group, hearing of their captured friends, and deciding it was a noble battle. Despite his misgivings, his overall opinion of them was positive, save for one thing. Hugo. Why did they have this child with them? What exactly happened at Cairden Evil that they were refusing to talk about? Why did they keep telling Hugo that the woman he was looking for was in Bremen? The group headed to Bremen with Never's mighty reindeer, Briar. As they passed Bryn Shander, they saw it burning to the ground, with harpies flying around, swooping residents off to eat them farther away. But what awaited them was even worse. Rather than burned, Bremen had been ripped apart by ice. Buildings sunk into the snow, and every location they once knew was gone, replaced with a large spire of ice. Hugo would leave them here, splitting off to engage some cold light walkers with his electrical powers. The rest of the party chose to confront Charlie in the spire. The lobby had a mock version of a hotel lobby, encased in ice, complete with an icy receptionist. It is at this point Quentin would use divine sense to get an idea of how many souls were in the building. Perhaps the fates made a mistake, for he assumed the 2 souls he saw to be the receptionist and Charlie. But divine sense only allows for the detections of gods and demons, so who is to say what he really saw? 6 Point climbed the spire, coming face to face with Charlie, his cleric's armor now infused with ice. "So, you made it! You do care, huh?" He'd bring out the head of Ripple to taunt them, before engaging them in combat. And though he was formidable, he fell, just as the rest. The party burned his head to prevent his resurrection. At this moment, the Frost Maiden's plan to increase Quentin's Morning Lord attachment would go awry. Michonne was only 1 floor above, but in a panic, Quentin neglected to check. The party escaped the building with their lives, watching as the spire crumbled. But they wouldn't celebrate, for they heard a deathly shriek, punctuated with a sickening crack, as Mishan's chained body hit the ground and was crushed by a spire of crumbling ice. Such failure would bring Act 2 to a close. Now we will move on to Act 3, which is entitled, Where Shall I Place My Faith? Quentin immediately found his consciousness summoned to the Morning Lord's palace. He would find the sun deity burning brightly in an empty void, not radiating with a gentle warmth, but burning with hatred. A simple task. Simpler than chopping wood. Simpler than lighting a fire. And you failed me! The Morning Lord would rip into Quentin, calling him all manner of insults as the barbarian pleaded for mercy. Mercy, huh? Very well. The sun must return, after all. But I am not a merciful god. You shall bear my curse, my flame, and now know that you belong to me, and to me alone. He would show Quentin his true form, taking all but one of his hit points, and leaving him on the verge of death. When Quentin awoke in the real world, his body burned with small flames, but none of them would go out. He was cursed. Eventually, he would come to accept this, and the party would search for survivors. They'd find several, among them Cora. She'd try to embrace Hugo, but find him emotionally distant. Where is Fell? He would growl. 6 Point had no answer. They had lied and told him here in Bremen. But in reality, she was already quite dead. Hugo would become enraged at being lied to, accidentally electrocuting Smoke before leaving, saying, I'm going back to Caer Dineval. I want to know the truth. Smoke would also leave the room and begin looking for the rags. Feeling compelled to do so, Sorrow and Carragher would follow at a distance, watching as he approached a destroyed bakery. In the cellar, Smoke faced despair. Most of the rags had frozen and died, curled up against the wall. Among the living was Stone, now missing an arm. Stone would express happiness at Smoke's return, but eventually his words turned bitter. Pointing to the corpses, he said, They all didn't make it. Nobody came to save us. One by one, they all laid against the wall to die. And soon, I'll join them. Smoke would resolve himself to prevent this situation from ever happening again. You know, Smoke, that whole thing with the Grimwoods, it never ended up mattering. You stalked that barbarian and fed us info for nothing. They used us and they left us behind anyway. Sorrow and Carragher would be alarmed at hearing this and immediately run. Sorrow ran to pretend like he wasn't involved, while Carragher ran to tell Quentin about it. Smoke ended up following Sorrow's footprints after hearing the two stomping around upstairs. What did you hear? About everything you've done. Just about. You have no right to eavesdrop on me. This was absolutely true. Doubly so considering Sorrow's position as the Frost Maiden's eyes. But he resisted anyway. You can't tell me what to do? With a sneer, he'd walk away. Quentin, on the other hand, would be alarmed by the news as well. You were just in it as a job? So our whole friendship was just a lie? No, it's more complicated than that. They'd argue without any real conclusion, as never would stop them. They had hostages to protect, after all. They'd never get a chance to resolve it, because right then a raven delivered a letter from Copper. The black cabin was refurbished. Seeing this news, the party gathered the hostages and set out. The view atop the mountains was horrid. In the distance, around Caer Dineval, a storm raged, crackling with electricity and snow. And in Bryn Shander, refugees fled left and right as harpies descended upon them to feast. They would also find the Black Iron guy crashed into the mountain, his suit of armor inexplicably destroyed, but nobody really cared about him, so they moved on. The group would resolve to return, moving on to the Black Cabin. "Oh, you're here. I fixed the old girl up real nice for you." Copper would see Quentin's sullen face, fire, and other signs of emotional duress, and trail off. Mishon didn't make it. Quentin, cursed as he was, wished for death. Copper would sympathetically sigh, passing on these words. "Mishon carried the light before. Now she's gone. You need to carry it now. You owe her that much. Bring the sun back to Icewind Dale." Now came time for a reckoning. I think we should check in on Caer Dineval. But what about the people of Bryn Shander? The party would split here. Carragher and Never would fly to Caer Dineval. Smoke, Quentin, and Sorrow would go to Bryn Shander. But before we can tell these stories, what happened to Hugo? Well, as you can guess, he did not find any kind of peace in Caer Dineval. He and Barry found the Black Knights in the process of burial, Fell's burial. As the two stood before the coffin, Barry felt an immeasurable guilt. He confessed that he and the others had killed Fell and lied about it. Hugo would be shocked, but it did confirm what he had already thought since he had left. So when the Black Knights came to bring him back into the fold, he was not exactly in the best mood. An outburst of energy sent a knight through one of the walls, directly into a hidden cell containing several children. Several lay dying, and another lay against the cell door, crying bitterly. The dying had Chardalyn Manasite growing from their skulls. "What is this?" One child's hands burned with fire, another were numb with frostbite, and he could feel his own electricity crackling. The Black Knights had stuck Manasite into their heads. That was why they could control elements. And it was all sanctioned by King Zardarok himself. It became apparent that Fell had saved him, and only him, from the overexposure to Chardalyn. By the looks of things, these kids were each at different stages through the process, and mostly in the dying stages. By taking him as her own, she had spared him. But now she was dead, an injustice everlasting. In a fit of rage, Hugo began tearing the Black Knights apart, and in one flash of energy he destroyed everything in the castle. He spared Edwin, the last survivor, and he allowed all the dying to rest in peace. He would turn to Barry. "Start running." Attracted by this surge of energy, Sefik would deviate from his route to Targos, finding Hugo in the wreckage. "Was that you? You've got quite a power." Hugo would shoot a bolt of lightning at Sefik's head, choosing not to respond. After a narrow dodge, Sefik was quite impressed. "You don't want to talk, eh? Well, then allow me to indulge you." The two would begin to fight, causing a massive storm to whip up. This would be the state Never and Carragher found the pair. With Hugo eventually falling, Never would bravely run onto the field. "Stop! Just let me administer first aid. I'm a healer." Sevik would watch as Never cast healing magic. As he did so, he whispered to the boy, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to summon everything you've got left and throw it at him all at once." Hugo would stand before unleashing the full extent of his power. Never and Carragher would wake in a snowbank, but Caer had been completely wiped from the map. Nymetra had been flung headlong into a mountain and killed, and Sefik had been gravely injured but survived. And of course, Hugo was nowhere to be found. He left the two a note in the snow. "Sorry." From there, he'd leave to chase after Barry. In the meantime, the rest of Six Point rescued civilians from Bryn Shander. Smoke would bravely rescue a toddler from a burning building. Assisted by Sorrow and Quentin, Smoke and the rest would rescue civilians from the burning city. Eventually, they'd be targeted by the largest of the harpies, the Icy Harpy. But, in a display of bravery, Sheriff Markham would light a torch above the gates of the city, drawing the harpy unto himself to avoid him attacking the cart filled with survivors. His sacrifice was successful, and they all made it back to the cabin, where Never quickly ushered them inside and activated his defense systems to pick off any harpies that might have followed them. It is at this point that the werewolf crew, or the feral few, I suppose, would show up on the cabin's doorstep, asking for Never. Led by Hadrian, their leader, they claimed to be looking to have some fun and wanted to help in any way that they could. Eventually, an agreement was made that they would lead the party to a new town in the morning, a place named Goodmead, in exchange for some rations. Smoke had an altercation with them, and when defeated, decided to cheat them out of these rations. But this would only become a problem tomorrow. In the meantime, Smoke, enraged by the treatment he had received, decided to be vengeful. But not to the werewolves, because he couldn't kill the werewolves. Instead, he decided to leave the window unlocked. But not his window. No, not the window of his room. The room Sorrow was staying in. Because yes, Smoke had not forgotten what Sorrow had said about not being able to force him to do anything. Smoke had not forgotten, and so he left the window open. And sure as hell, by the morning Sorrow was dead. Sorrow would awaken in a fox's body, unsure of how far his soul has traveled. He would venture through the woods, and eventually be caught by a trapper named Fef. It was certainly an unlucky string of events, but it would prompt the Frost Maiden to change her plan a little. Luckily for her, by this point, she had already created a suitable replacement. After all, she had brought Asada out of cold storage, helped him regain his strength, and nursed him back to health, all while giving him a new sword, one that would allow him to tap into his newfound strength as one of her followers. So, in a storm, she would send him to the party, hoping that he might befriend them and follow them on their adventure. Coincidentally, in possibly the craziest plot twist in all of the Forgotten Realms, Momentous decided that now was the perfect time for his son to complete his trials as an adult male. He would send Gog, his turtle son, through the layers of the earth, which would rob him of his memories and his past, sending him through the crust of the world until he landed in a snowbank right outside of the black cabin, next to a very, very confused samurai named Asada. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Perhaps Momentous just wanted to fuck with them. But no one can say, because no one knows, not even me. The wolves would keep their promise, leading everyone to Goodmead. But on the way there, they would spy another wolf in the woods and decide they needed a bit of a snack in more ways than one. So Hadrian and his cronies would ditch everyone in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night. But with a little bit of perseverance, everyone made it through. They entered the city of Goodmead. This city was small and quaint, famous for its mead, which tasted as if it were honey. It was a delicacy, and the town was very prosperous for it. First encounter they had in the town was with a trapper named Fef, carrying a cage with a fox in it. Smoke would introduce himself and ask about the wearings on of the town. Fef would tell him that he had just witnessed a horrible tragedy. The speaker had died, and it was horrifying. But he had turned to alcohol for the first time in his life to forget the awful memory, meanwhile carrying, unknowingly, sorrow in a cage. The party would resolve to fight whatever monster had killed the speaker, which would eventually turn out to be a large being named Doog, who they would murder very quickly. This would, thankfully, allow them a good standing within the town of Goodmead. And, to be honest, Doog did cave people's heads in, so no one really had a problem with it. They would also learn that the speaker, now being dead, meant that there was an opening for Speaker of the Town. Smoke, realizing that this was the perfect chance to prevent any further tragedy, such as the one he had experienced back in Bremen, decided that it would be a good idea to enter this race against a candidate named Shandor Bradley, who had a degree in psychology and was quite a man, so to speak. He wasn't very nice, but he did good results. That was what the town thought of him. So it would be. The politics of Goodmead would begin. The end result of these politics would be that Smoke would become the speaker, and Shandor Bradley would be outed as an abyssal slime masquerading as a human being. Which is gross, but it happened. And then he got frozen and sent to prison. But he eventually escaped, so I guess that wasn't the greatest end to that arc. Anyway, it is here we come to the events of the GOG one-shot, which starred GOG, obviously, and Never. One morning during the campaign, GOG received a vision from Momentous, one that he ended up pulling Never into as well. Momentous told GOG that he had found a piece of his memory, a memory of his parents and the origins of their father-son dynamic. He would show GOG that his father had summoned a demon from the abyss, though none of them would know that this spirit that had been summoned was actually Sorrow, the wandering spirit. This wandering spirit would proceed to kill everyone in the house, save for the young boy, as he was out playing with a friend at the time, before leaving and going off to do whatever spirits do. Momentous would then show him that he had taken GOG in under his wing after his family had died, and he would reveal the location of Hugo, who happened to be looking for the Circle of the Dale. But what happened to Hugo? He had left, searching for this circle, after he had executed Barry for his crime. But At Never's insistence, the circle seemed like something worthwhile to find. After all, they were altruistic, and they were in the interest of Icewind Dale. If anyone was good and willing to help, it would be them. What he found was civil war. Half the druids wanted to flee. The other half wanted to stay and help. Those who stayed begged Hugo to help them stop their compatriots. After all, there was a curse at play. As they began to lose, the battlefield changed. A hole opened in the snowy barrier, allowing escape into the sunlight. And behind everyone came a great snowstorm. Smiling, Sefik Khosrow would appear and pull Hugo to his feet. You've been annihilating everyone. Have I now? Hugo would watch as those who fled to the sunlight began to burn, and in an instant he understood. Sefik's forces would sweep the area, removing the Dale residents. Sefik, having seen Hugo's skill a second time, would take an interest. He would show him Frozen Chamber of Souls, the place where the Frost Maiden was keeping all those who they had abducted to keep away from the sunlight, to protect them from the Morning Lord's curse should a battle ensue. And recognizing the situation they were in, Hugo would help the Frost Maiden. Never and Gog would find Hugo after this, who would be angry about the state of the circle, stating that they had given him bruises. This, of course, was a lie, one that he told to prevent Never from finding out about the truth about the circle, that the circle had had a civil war, and that, unfortunately, everyone that hadn't gone into the Frost Maiden's bunker had been annihilated by the sunlight. It was a lie that spared him the guilt of what had happened. So they would depart from one another. Gog and Never would go back to the village, and Hugo would continue working with the Frost Maiden. Now, we could return to the main party at this point. However, I find it prudent that we talk next about the events of the Vorig one-shot that happened sometime after this with just Henry playing Vorig, and it covers the events of what exactly he has been doing since he left us at Cairden Evil so long ago. Our story begins, of course, in the Sunblight Crag, which Vorig had traveled to with the Durgar. Once there, he found himself with a particularly nasty authority figure, named the Administrator. He would chastise Vorig for his decision to destroy the Black Knights for their Chardalin. After all, the low-level Durgar did not know that the Black Knights worked for King Zardarok. So, the Administrator would ask for them to be executed and throw Vorig in a prison cell. Such it would be that Vorig would be deprived of alcohol and left to rot in a cell for over a week, though to him, in his alcohol-deprived state, it would feel like a month, or perhaps a year, or maybe 10. Either way, logistically it was a week. Eventually, another prisoner was placed in with him, a knight who seemed to never take his helmet off, even to sleep. The Administrator would return to the cells, having decided to give Vorig another chance. Here is my task for you. You will go and find those missing children. You will find them and you will bring them to me. If you do this, I will grant you access to our king, Zardarok, to serve him as his most loyal servant. Vorig, being locked in a jail cell, would agree to this, as pretty much anything was better than being locked up and deprived of alcohol. What a wait, he would say. If I'm going, I'm taking that knight with me. This knight, who came to be known as the Radiant Knight for the way his fists would glow with burning light, and how he had attacked the gates with fierce and raging, light-powered magic, was not exactly the best choice, one might say, but he got the job done. Vorig called him Rad, and once they were both equipped, they headed off to find this child. Rad was in the game to kill King Zardarok. Vorig was in the game to take his throne. It was only natural that they would work together. After all, their goals coincided. The first town that they would head to was known as Dogan's Hole. It was a town filled with tribal people, who were said to fight every single morning to determine the strongest among them, and that person would be the chieftain for the day. Rad would enter this fray as a sort of cultural exchange, and he would do well, until eventually meeting a large, burly man who everyone just referred to as Chief. He would go by no other title. He would break Rad's breastplate and knock him unconscious with a blow to the head, a kick so hard that his helmet caved in. Needless to say, the villagers were quite impressed that Rad had joined their conflict and had made a good name for himself. As such, they had the village's respect. And when the chieftain came to talk to them, he said that he did not know of any strange magical children, but if they needed a companion for their journey, then his daughter was at the top of the mountain practicing with her weapon. A weapon that was not like anything that the villagers had ever used before. Though he warned them, if any of them wanted to take her hand in marriage, they would have to go through him first. A prospect neither man was really in the mood for. They ventured up the mountain, facing tribulation after tribulation as they surfaced. Eventually they found a bare-eared girl shooting at a mound of snow. When she heard them step on a stick, she almost shot Vorig's ear off, but just barely missed. She was holding some kind of weapon, something she called the Throngler. It was some kind of gun. It shot bullets, and bullets made of magic at that. Vorig was very interested, and upon learning that her demeanor was a woman who merely wanted to fight and find glory like most of the rest of her tribe, he decided to enlist her to follow him. Absinthe was her name, and she would become his second treasured companion. Of course, I say treasured lightly, because as you'll see later, perhaps they weren't so treasured after all. With his second companion found, Vorig and the rest headed for Goodmead. In the town, they found a blacksmith who was part dwarf and part elf. His name was Yor, and in that blacksmith's shop they found a light silver-haired boy who was using wind from his hands. Of course, being rather overzealous, the moment Absinthe saw this, she tackled him to the ground, and the others moved to restrain him. Vorig got down on a knee and began to ramble about how this boy could help him achieve his goals. To ramble about how, with this boy's help, he might make something great happen in Icewind Dale, and more importantly, in the Sunblight Crag. He would tell the boy he did not intend for him to stay captured forever, and that once he had gained King Zardarok's favor and taken his throne for himself, he would set the boy free. As such, the boy would stop struggling, and they would bring him back to the Sunblight Crag. Henceforth, they would do this work for the Administrator. Zardarok and the Administrator sought these elemental children in an effort to fuel and to drive their Chardalyn dragon. Edwind, the boy who was taken, was eventually used to cause the creature to fly. With his wind magic, he could make it work. But that would be something we would learn far later than this. At this point, we return to the main party, who is still hopelessly left in Goodmead, solving politics and the like. Eventually, Olivessa and Fef would recommend that Smoke head out as a liaison to the Sunblight Crag. After all, everyone in Icewind Dale knew they were working on some kind of weapon, a dragon perhaps, to destroy the Frost Maiden, and with the party firmly against the Frost Maiden, save for Asada, who had visited her and seen her plan, it only seemed natural to ally with someone who could do such a thing. So they went. They would journey to the Sunblight Crag. On the way, they would encounter the village of Dogan's Hole. But since they had not arrived in the morning, and chose not to come at that time, they missed the ritual, and as such, the villagers were quite hostile. And so the chieftain grumbled and refused to help them with anything, sending them on their way to the Sunblight Crag. Here they would meet the administrator, who would tell them the same thing he told Vorig, that attacking the Black Knights was not helpful, and in fact an annoyance, and something they would have to make up for. Unperturbed, they would still ask for an audience with King Zardarok, only to be denied by the administrator. "You know, if you want to see the king, perhaps you can do a favor for me first. On top of this mountain there is a great white dragon, which stomps its feet and makes our ceiling shake. Go kill it and bring me its heart. King Zardarok will surely meet you if we have a feast prepared." The party would oblige, having really no other choice. They would head to the top of the mountain and slay the white dragon. They would see Gog consume the entire thing. And Asada and Never would believe, for a moment, that they had been transported to an alternate reality. But eventually they would come back, and Asada would have the revelation that his people had merged with society and given up their samurai culture, even though what they could have seen might have been false. They brought the dragon heart to the administrator, who finally allowed them to see King Zardarok, finally allowed them into the rest of the facility, including a large foreboding door, which seemed to lead into complete nothingness. He promised to let them meet with Zardarok the next day. Next, Smoke would decide to sneak away from the group, investigating the large door. His companion, which often took the form of a crow, had stopped responding to him, and instead came as the fox which had been bonded to his soul so long ago. If I forgot to mention, that fox was Sorrow, and he had become bonded to Smoke after realizing that his small form was diminutive and could not be used for anything else. He was no longer in a human body, and so he clung to his once party mate. If he could speak, he would have told Smoke not to go through that door, because what he found was the abyss, a place that taunted him with Stone's death, taunted him with twisted visions of the people of Bremen dead, the people of his party dead, and the people of Goodmead dead, laying on the floor. Smoke would walk through this vision, denying it, saying that it wasn't real. He would deny everything, save for the small white fox sitting at the end of the road. Sorrow was there to guide him back to the real world. After all, he was a planeswalker. He had done this 1,000 times. So Smoke would come back, and he would return to the party, having done all he could to explore. Meanwhile, Asada would hear a voice in his head, telling him to open the gates. With this he knew the Frost Maiden had come, and that the end was upon everyone. So he would run, attempting to escape the area. At this point, Smoke and Quentin would go to visit with the king. The others would stay back, for fear of getting in the way. The meeting went oddly, as Zardarok was quite an interesting fellow. He was, well, shall we say, eccentric. He showed Quentin his pile of skulls, Mind Flayer skulls, and, caught by surprise, Everyone in the room would stop when an armed absinthe entered the room and attempted to take Zardarok's life. Quentin would defend Zardarok as he activated his ability, which would allow him to store power. Quentin fought Absinthe bravely, until Zardarok grew tired of their dispute and tossed Quentin aside, saying he would do it himself. He broke Absinthe's wrist against the wall, destroying her gun, kicking her, beating her, until eventually she lay broken and dying against the wall. He would have Quentin at his side. Now, Quentin, you will cut her down. You will do this for me, and we will be partners. I will help you in your quest to defeat the Frost Maiden, but you need to kill this traitor for me. Quentin would refuse, just in time to fall into Vorig's trap. Vorig would burst in, with an army of werewolves at his side, taking everyone prisoner. Sir, I detected that my two companions turned rogue and were attempting to plot your demise with these travelers. With this, Vorig threw his friends under the bus. He wanted power, and this was the way he saw to take it, by gaining the king's favor through a fake coup. It did not matter to him that Absinthe lay dying, nor that his friends would surely be executed for the grave crime of treason against the king. All that matters was that he got what he wanted. In the end, that was the kind of man Vorig Boneguard was. Zardarok would take them to the barracks to be executed. After all, treason was a crime dictated by a king, and a crime deserved punishment. Quentin and the rest were placed in shackles. Rad, Quentin, and Gog were set to be executed. Smoke had escaped, run down into the door to the abyss. Asada was nowhere to be found, and Vorig was leading the werewolves. It was at this point we find ourselves with 3 stories to tell. What happened to Smoke in the abyss? What happened to Asada outside? And what happened to our friends held up in the execution room? First, we shall tell the story of Smoke, who, in the escape from Vorig and his werewolf forces, ran to the abyss. He found himself once again facing visions, this time of Stone, who taunted him and told him that the things he had done were not going to amount to anything. In the end, ironically, he was right, but at the time, Smoke pushed back against this. I will never let this happen, he said. I will never let this thing that happened to you happen to anyone else. This mistake that I made, I will make good on it. And when he found himself again at the end of the path, he would find the planeswalker, Sorrow, waiting for him again. Sorrow would take him on his own journey, using the abyss to show him the things he had done, the family he had murdered, the lives he had taken, and the forms he had been in. He showed Smoke the night of his death. Smoke, leaving the window open, had left the werewolves to eat him alive. Though he was a spirit, he felt the pain of his host dying. He felt the pain of being launched across the world into the body of a fox. In the end, the two beings reconciled. Through guiding Smoke through his life and Smoke's, Sorrow would realize that it was time. After all, his spirit had been fading. Same as Momentous, oddly enough. He would decide that guiding Smoke through the abyss one last time was his way to go. He did not want to follow Smoke to the upper world. He led Smoke to the exit and bade him farewell, fading back into the abyss from whence he came. Smoke would find himself sitting under a tree outside as the final battle would begin. For Asada's part in all of this, he decided to be loyal at the very end. He opened the gates Beyond the gates came a stomping of boots as a massive army of Frost Maiden minions followed behind her. They were ready to take on the Sunblight Crag. As for Gog and Quentin, they found themselves tied up with Rad in the barracks. As Vorig had implicated the administrator, he immediately was beheaded by Zardarok, wielding his giant axe. In a desperation, Rad would reach out to Gog via psychokinesis, saying, "I can buy you some time. If you can get that axe away from him, we can kill him. Just help me before we get killed." Quentin and Gog would help him. Using all of their strength, they managed to pull the axe away from Zardarok. Quentin would grab it, and in a feat that no one quite understood, he grabbed the axe and shouted, "Morning Lord!" only to be summoned to the Morning Lord's palace. His mind. The Morning Lord, looking weaker than he had before, was reduced to but a smoldering flame. In a castle that still glowed brightly, he would ask Quentin one question. "Are you an idiot?" "Are you a fool?" he would ask. And Quentin would fight back. The Morning Lord would be confused as to why Quentin would ask for his help in the middle of the encounter, and taunt him about how now Zardarok would be killing his friends, since he had gone limp in the middle of the room, begging for the Morning Lord's help. He would taunt Quentin for trying to bring Mishon into his realm. After all, she resided within his own soul, as he had come to find out, but he could not bring her here. The world would simply not let him. The Morning Lord revealed his name to be Alistair Grimwood, tying the two of them together. And it would become then that the Morning Lord would make his final jest. "You take my place. The sun shall shine again in Icewind Dale. If not, you will have to make your own way. But I'm done. It's up to you." And the Morning Lord would get off his throne and walk into the void, leaving Quentin with an empty throne and a promise that if he took it, the sun would return to Icewind Dale. He sat on the throne, and in doing so, doomed all of Icewind Dale. For when he did, he indeed became the new Morning Lord. He became afflicted with the curse of the flame, cauterized by human greed and fallacy. He became imbued with its energy, and he caused the second burning, which killed thousands of people as the sun turned bright red and burned them to death. The Morning Lord Quentin would rise in the sky like a blister, raising the souls of the damned as cinders. In that moment, he truly became the Morning Lord, the one he so hated. He played into the very cycle that had created such a monster in the first place. He had become a monster. And as the Frost Maiden gazed in horror at the things that he had done, she leveled her sword at him, telling him that he would not pass her judgment, that he would be lost, and that he was going to die. The Morning Lord had an army of 10,000, while the Frost Maiden had a more meager army of 6,000. Our heroes decided that it'd be best if they joined the fight. Now, as for Never, he was off on his own business, gathering residents of surviving cities and bringing them for a mighty charge to bring to the battle later. But, as for the rest, they contributed in their own ways. Gog began to help, though not quite knowing why. He would join the fray. Asada would, of course, follow his master's beckoning and begin to fight. Smoke, upon seeing his friend in the sky, would reflexively try and help, but amidst the burning corpses, he would begin to lose his sanity. Eventually, he and Gog would come face to face on the battlefield, and Gog, in a rare moment of complete clarity, decided that Smoke was going to disappear, and that he had had enough of combat. He grabbed Smoke by a tendril and dragged him to a festering, bloody pit, where Momentous smiled. Smoke had been dragged away from the conflict. Now Gog could get to work. As for Vorig, he was betrayed. The werewolves wanted payment, so they brought him to the room where Rad and the rest were at, where Zardarok and the rest were fighting. Rad and Zardarok both turned on Vorig, as Rad punched his hole through Vorig's chest, picking him up and tossing him out the window. Rad would sit down and die, having avenged his friend, as Zardarok rushed out to the battlefield. Never would help in the fight, assisting the Frost Maiden by bringing a large expeditionary force. The Morning Lord would fight with pure evil, taking the lives of his subordinates to increase his own power and changing his tactics to destroy the most fundamental aspect of the Frost Maiden's army, the living humans within. Both sides would fight and suffer heavy losses until eventually the Morning Lord released a beam by scratching open his eyes, a beam of pure anger and light which knocked the Frost Maiden to the earth. He came to finish her off with a blinding blow, only to be stopped as lightning flashed across the battlefield. Hugo, imbued with his own power, sparked through and saved those who were present from the blast radius. The Morning Lord's blast did not kill everyone, but, speedy as he was, Hugo could not escape it himself. His legs were caught and incinerated. As he fell, he screamed. But, in a mad-ditch attempt, the Morning Lord would stand and leap, flying at the Frost Maiden and her final allies. Asada, seeing his chance, would raise his katana high above his head, the Frost Maiden willing him, with the last bit of her life, to swing down. She would grab his hands in her own, and together they would swing the blade, severing the evil deity's head from his shoulders. Finally, the ice had won over the fire. Finally, the wound had been repaid. The Morning Lord's corpse dropped to the ground, dead. The battle was won. In the aftermath, several things happened. Never found use for his lycanthrope serum, injecting Hugo with it, allowing his legs to regenerate. Asada comforted the Frost Maiden, who had gone into a much smaller form to conserve energy. She told Asada that if he ever wanted to, he could always return to her service. After all, Frost Maiden would need help in this new era, an era without the Morning Lord, an era without chaos. He smiled and said he would be back. Go to join his friends, of what remained anyway. Those who were left were few. Edwin, Hugo, Never, himself. Those were all that remained from the originals. They were a small band who had survived the carnage, survived to see dragons come from the sky to destroy the Morning Lord, survived to see the Morning Lord burn the world, survived to see night once again overtake Icewind Dale, and the sun to once again rise. They would set off on their own journey later. But that's not my story to tell. As for the Morning Lord, with no host and no power, the fire simply faded. All that was left was a ruined sword, embedded in the ground in a pedestal, guarded by a weeping ghost who wept for the strong man who was once Quentin. And finally, across Icewind Dale, in the fortress of Arl the Frost Maiden, the frozen souls dug their way to the surface and once again saw the sunlight. Thank you everyone for listening. Goodbye.